Even though there is no hard and fast rule for admitting any country into NATO, there is one hidden qualification for joining NATO. The newly joining country must not have any major border dispute. This is the weakness the Russian President Mr. Vladimir Putin exploited to discourage neighboring countries around Russia from joining NATO. As a strategy to this plan, the Russian army occupied Crimea and the Donbas region, making Ukraine ineligible to join the NATO. But on September 2021, NATO conducted a joint military exercise with Ukraine. The military drill was codenamed Defender Europe 2021. It was a simulation of NATO attacking Russia. How much more evil can this act of NATO be? So what is a joint military exercise anyway? Think of a situation where a bunch of thieves arrive near your house and conduct a mock drill of breaking in and robbing a house or a bank somewhere. Whom are they going to rob? Of course, you can be sure your house is not in that list. Yes, the thieves will not break into your house. After all, the police and law enforcement officials are there to protect you, right? But how will you feel about thieves roaming around your house and their practice of a break-in? That's exactly how Russia feels about NATO expansion and its military drills near its border. But wait, NATO is supposed to be the good guys, right? The defender of the free world. It is the Russians and the Chinese, with their autocratic rule, the real villains. That's what we hear from all Western media and in all Hollywood movies. Remember the Hollywood movie Behind the Enemy Lines? What is the military power of NATO that Russia is so annoyed about? Let's explore. NATO was founded on 4th April 1949 by 12 countries with headquarters at Brussels, Belgium. It is a system of collective security where an attack on any one member is considered an attack on all the member states. It has been invoked only once in response to the September 11 attacks. Its main goal is a quick response to any Soviet aggression. NATO is politically headed by the Secretary General of NATO, who is always a civilian. Secretary General is more of a spokesman and has no military command. The Secretary General is advised by the chair of the NATO Military Committee, along with the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. The Supreme Allied Commander is the operation commander of NATO and is always a US military officer. NATO has no parliament or voting system. When it comes to decision making, the big powers like the US, UK and France take the decisions and other members follow. NATO had 16 member states till the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. In 1994, the newly formed Russian Federation applied for membership, and that same year, Russia joined the Partnership for Peace program. Russia-NATO Council was established in 2002 for handling security issues and joint projects. With this, the very purpose of NATO's existence came into question. But NATO continued to exist and began expanding eastward. Russia's attitude to NATO began to change when former Soviet republics like Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania were admitted to NATO. This brought NATO to Russian borders. Russia, under the new leadership of Mr. Putin, began to suspect NATO's intentions. By 2022, NATO officially moved closer to admit Bosnia, Herzegovina, Georgia and Ukraine. At this time, Putin had declared NATO as a true enemy of Russia and made it the primary reason to invade Ukraine. So why is Putin scared of NATO? What kind of threat does NATO pose to Russia? NATO has no army of its own. Everything is contributed by its member states and operates under a joint command structure. So what kind of numbers can NATO come up with in case of war? NATO has a combined military strength of 5.4 million compared to just 1.3 million soldiers of the Russian army. NATO has a total of 20,723 aircrafts compared to 4,173 aircrafts of Russia. NATO has a total of 2,049 military ships against 605 military ships of Russia. As can be seen from the figures, Russia does not stand a chance in case of war. Russia has a total of 6,257 nuclear warheads, of which 1,456 are currently deployed. For the NATO, US has 5,550 nuclear warheads, of which 1,357 are deployed. United Kingdom has 225 nuclear warheads, of which 120 are deployed. France has 290 nukes, of which 280 are deployed. So the final figure is, Russia has 6,257 nukes versus NATO's tally of 6,065. In 1986, during the height of Cold War, the former Soviet Union had 45,000 nuclear warheads aimed at NATO countries, ready for use. NATO's Joint Forces Setup, which oversees the deployment of all assets of the alliance, is called the Allied Joint Force Command and is based out of Brunssum in Netherlands. The conduct of the land operation is executed from Allied Land Command at Izmir in Turkey. NATO also has a joint command center at Naples in Italy. NATO's Combined Air Command is called the Allied Air Command and is based at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. It oversees the deployment of 20,723 aircrafts across the European continent. NATO's Combined Naval Setup is called Allied Maritime Command and is based out of Northwood Headquarters in northwest London. It oversees the deployment of 2,049 ships and patrol boats. NATO also has a communication command called NATO Communications and Information Systems Service Agency at Mons in Belgium. NATO also has a nuclear planning group which was set up in 1966. The purpose of this group is to effectively plan the distribution and strategy of use of nuclear weapons in case of war. Among the members, only US, UK and France have nuclear weapons. Hence, the idea is to transfer the nuclear bombs to countries that do not have any nukes. The hosting country is supposed to make the infrastructure available for safe storage, maintenance, and deployment of the weapon in case the war breaks out. Example, the United Kingdom received US tactical nuclear weapons such as nuclear artillery and Lance missiles until 1992. Even though the UK is a nuclear weapon state in its own right, they were mainly deployed in Germany. As of 2021, 100 tactical B-61 nuclear bombs are believed to be deployed in Europe under the Nuclear Sharing Agreement. The weapons are stored within a wall in hardened aircraft shelters using the US Air Force weapon storage and security systems. The delivery planes used are the F-16s and Panavia Tornadoes. This is the true essence of NATO. Nukes all over Europe. Any peace-loving country would have to swallow the bitter experience of hosting hundreds of nuclear bombs in their land. This is one of the main reasons for countries like Finland, Sweden, Switzerland have stayed away from NATO. Also, when a country is admitted into NATO, it will have to take the concurrence from the main partners like the US and the UK regarding almost everything, like foreign policy, trade policy, military weapons purchase, etc. Of course, a country cannot aspire to buy major military hardware from Russia or China if they are NATO members. This is quite ironic, as it is difficult to say whether freedom is lost or gained. NATO has two official languages, English and French. NATO advises its members to spend a minimum of 2% of their GDP on defense. Of that, 20% must be exclusively spent on military equipment. Currently, the US, Greece, Poland, Estonia, and UK met the 2% target. For countries like Iceland, which has no army, NATO is the best deal. Iceland spends just 0.1% of its GDP on defense. The combined military spending of 28 member countries is a whopping $1.026 trillion US. Russian military budget is only $65.9 billion US last year. NATO has an administrative expense of $252 million used mainly to fund the NATO headquarters in Belgium. So how will NATO actually react if any of its member states are attacked? NATO Response Force is the first unit to respond to any attack. The force comprising land, air, sea, and special forces unit are capable of being deployed quickly. The NRF comprises of up to 40,000 troops and includes units from several countries that do not belong to the NATO, for example Finland. On 11 February 2022, just a few days before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a US Army Brigade combat team of about 4,700 troops from the 82nd Airborne Division was ordered to Poland, while a Striker squadron was sent from Wilczek-Rose barracks to Romania. Since so many countries are involved, communications becomes critical. NATO's prime connectivity with its members is through NATO Kronos, which is abbreviated as Crisis Response Operations in NATO operating systems. NATO membership is only on invitation. All NATO member countries must agree to include any new member. Even though there is no checklist, some basic qualifications are there. New members must uphold democracy, including tolerating diversity. New members must be making progress towards a market economy. Their military forces must be firmly under civilian control. They must be good neighbors and respect sovereignty outside their borders. They must be working toward compatibility with NATO forces. So the Soviet Union has fallen. Then why is NATO expanding? Who are NATO's enemies? There cannot be anyone except Russia. NATO has become completely evil now. When the Berlin Wall was broken, leading to the unification of Germany, NATO diplomats gave assurance to Soviet leaders that NATO will not expand east. The US Foreign Secretary at that time, Mr. James Baker, famously said, NATO will not expand an inch eastwards, but they did not commit anything on paper and only gave oral assurance. Later, NATO began to aggressively expand, adding new Warsaw members like Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania. A few years later, Baltic states like Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia became members, virtually encircling Russia. In spite of the collapse of communism and with Russia adopting democracy and a market economy, it has maintained a distance from all NATO nations. Russia is still the main competitor in the sale of weapons. Russia supports Iran, Israel's archenemy and US ally. Russia, even though not a superpower, has taken the role of the former Soviet Union, balancing Western aggression in Syria and the Middle East. The West wanted a one-side world dominated by the US and NATO. Any second front must be crushed. The US and Western allies have used the media to portray themselves as guardians of freedom and democracy. They expect every country to be subservient to them and serve the economic interest. In fact, it is a new version of imperialism. For example, Western media never talks about how the US government toppled democratically elected leader of Iran, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, in 1953. He was overthrown after he nationalized the production of oil in his country. The US and the UK then put autocratic and useless king Mohammad Reza Pahlavi as the head of Iran. To help him rule smoothly, the CIA also created a secret police called Sabak to arrest and prosecute any opposition to his rule. The US and the NATO, above everything else, need money and absolute control. Hence, a dictator or an autocratic ruler is the best bet for their business and for selling their weapons. For example, in Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. But when the same despotic leader does not bow down to the West, like Putin, then what follows is sanctions and war. Either a direct war, like in the case of Saddam Hussein, or a proxy war in case of Russia. The US recently ousted Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan using the army influence. Because even though he was a democratically elected leader, Imran Khan was trying to make his country independent and non-aligned like India. This was not in US interest. The US proved to be an outright thug when on 3rd Jan 2020, cold-bloodedly murdered Major General Qasem Soleimani. A Predator drone fired missiles at his unarmed convoy while en route to Iraqi airport. However evil he might be, can the US murder a serving army general of a country? All Iran could do was to protest to the UN and send an Interpol alert to arrest US President Donald Trump, the man who ordered the killing. Iran has a democratically elected government, unlike Saudi Arabia, but Iran is subjected to the harshest of sanctions on lines of North Korea. For what? This is America's world, and Iran will not bow down. Another peculiar attribute of the US and the NATO is that, in spite of being strong democracies, there is absolutely no difficulty for these countries to go to war. From Vietnam to Libya, the US Congress gives a thumbs up to their respective presidents at the time. Even a dictator would not be able to match this unique convincing ability of the American and European politicians. Plunder and loot can now be done in a civilized way, with all approvals. The trick here is controlling the media. You can do whatever you want, invade and kill millions, but who's going to know if the media portrays you as a saint? No wonder the big technocrats like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk bought media outlets with full cash payment. If war is not an option, then crippling sanctions are. Sanctions is the most interesting part of Western aggression. US is a market economy and all its businesses are private. The US in fact takes pride in zero government interference in private businesses. Yet, when sanctions on Russia was announced, all the private businesses, including restaurant chains like McDonald's and Starbucks, announced that they are exiting the country. How are all private companies participating in US government sanctions on a country? Don't they have any freedom to decide whether to do business in Russia or not? It's a well-known fact that the CEOs of these American companies are ruthless about growth and profit. But over here, they're shutting down all branches and exiting Russia completely. The whole idea of minimum government interference is a facade. The Western media never calls the Vietnam War a defeat. It only says American foreign policy failure. This war was fought over 20 years, with the US Army losing over 58,000 servicemen. The US dropped 2 times more bombs in Vietnam than in all of World War II, killing over 3 million Vietnamese. The US Army also sprayed 11 million gallons of herbicide and defoliant chemical, codenamed Agent Orange, all over North Vietnam. Over 3 million Vietnamese were affected by this chemical. Other than causing birth defects and cancer, Agent Orange also caused enormous environmental damage in Vietnam. The NATO, as a show of its need of existence, invoked the collective security theme after the September 11 terrorist attacks on the US by invading Afghanistan. Taliban was a weak enemy with no air defense. It was more of a terrorist operation. This was the only war which the entire world, including Russia and China, supported. Russia supplied military hardware like the T-72 tanks and provided small arms to the Northern Alliance and also cooperated with the CIA. China supplied all the intelligence it had and rallied support of the militia in eastern Afghanistan. Even the Iranians supported the war. Even they wanted Al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan. Pakistan was forced to support the war. But the actual investment and the groundwork was done by the US and its allies. Other than curbing terrorism and capturing Osama bin Laden, the war in Afghanistan did not have any other incentives. Afghanistan was a dirt poor, terrorist-infected Muslim country. For the Americans and the NATO, the war in Afghanistan gave one of the lowest return on investment. That is why in just 3 years, the US began to focus on Iraq, the treasure cow. The Iraq invasion in 2003 was by far the most successful for the US and its allies. With a coalition casualty of just 4,825 soldiers and taking control of the country with the second largest oil reserves in the world, was by far the highest return on investment for the West. But for the Iraqi citizens, it was hell on earth. After the fall of Saddam Hussein, Iraq plunged into insurgency and civil war. From 2003 to 2007, around 100,000 Iraqi civilians lost their lives due to insurgency. And from 2013 to 2017, the civil war started killing scores of more Iraqi civilians. Iraq could have been well off and peaceful under Saddam Hussein than under US invasion and occupation. The torture and the abuse of detainees by the CIA in Iraqi prisons was seen all across the globe. Western media is calling the Russian army as war criminals when their own army has committed such horrible acts against humanity and walked away scot-free. Before going to war, Russia has countless times asked NATO to give it an assurance in writing that they will not expand. This was a simple request, but NATO refused. They could have saved the lives of more than 20,000 people who have died so far in the war. This is how much NATO values people's life in other countries. Now they are putting up a show of support to the heroic Ukrainians by supplying them with all kinds of sophisticated weapons, when actually the war itself could have been avoided. Even now, NATO can stop the war if it is able to convince Putin on their expansion plans. But they will not do it. NATO must stop arming Ukrainians with dangerous weapons. This will only make the war more destructive. Ukrainians cannot defeat Russians in war. If Putin decides to use nuclear weapons, then the situation is irreversible. Ukraine will be flattened and all its citizens would perish. This would also force NATO to step into the war, which is effectively World War III. The lives of millions is at stake. Leave alone expansion. NATO has no reason to exist. It has survived the purpose for which it was created. It was supposed to bring peace and stability to Europe, but is actually taking the world to the Cold War era of perpetual anxiety of a nuclear war.